we're having a lot of fun trying to figure out all these virtual events online. And I had a great couple of days revisiting Joe Burgess and meeting girls night, the characters from Girls Night Out, which was a lot of fun for me. So to me, rereading some of these books, it's so obvious that you care about your craft and you care about the writing that you're putting out for us all. And we are falling in love with all of your characters. So just to introduce Kate, Kate is a young writer who has, I think, 3 books coming out this year.
Oh,
Is that correct?
I have no idea how many. It should be 3.
Okay, so there's a number 10 in the Thea Kozik series, Death Comes Knocking, which is due in September. Joe Burgess, A Word of Deceit, number 7, coming out in November. And the one that I am super excited about, A New Romantic Suspense, which I'm hoping she'll tell us a little bit more about. I think that her writing is going to fit this genre just perfectly, so I'm super excited about it. And that is Wedding Bell Ruse. But Kate was also a finalist for the Edgar Award, the Agatha Award, the Anthony Award, the Derringer Award, a 5-time finalist for the Maine Literary Award for Crime Fiction, and a 2-time winner for the Maine Literary Award for Crime Fiction. Also a winner of the Public Safety Writers Association Award Nonfiction. She's also been super involved in the writing community by teaching writing. She was a founding member of the New England Crime Bank, served as the international president for Sisters in Crime, and taught and also started a publishing company, if I'm reading that correctly on your, which is very, very cool. So welcome. So go ahead.
No, go ahead. No, no, just finish your, please.
Okay. So how we're going to run tonight is we just want to welcome everybody. Danny Fortin, who is our teen librarian from MacArthur Library, is here this evening with me as well. And we hope that you will all participate by asking the questions. We try to keep this very casual and open so that this is your chance to really get to know the author and get a little bit more about their writing. So what we'll do is, if you have questions, you can either raise your hand or you can ask a question in the chat space, and Danny will field the questions for you. But so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Kate Flora.
Oh my gosh. Well, okay. Hello, everyone. This is very exciting. I mean, I see that Claire, who is a finalist for the Maine Literary Award, is with us tonight, right? And I see my son and my daughter-in-law and my law school classmates and my best friend and all of these people. This is so very cool to see all of you here. Hello, Alice, my neighbor. If I don't know you, perhaps by the time, I see a librarian or 2 out there. Hi, Mary Lou. So I guess I always do a tiny sort of intro, which is this. I started writing mysteries after I had stopped working in the Attorney General's office and taken a break from practicing law. And one of the things that fascinated me, that sort of became the driver for writing mysteries rather than some other kind of literature, so other kind of fiction mostly, was the question of good and evil. When I was, prosecuting deadbeat dads who weren't supporting their children, when I was working on when I was working on battered children, when I was working on employment discrimination, when I was working on a lot of the things that I got to work on in the Maine Attorney General's office, I kept wondering, what is it that lets some people think that they are allowed to sort of opt out of the social compact that we've all kind of signed on to, which says that you don't hurt people, that you don't take things that aren't yours. The basic set of rules that I think we all try to live by. And so I began to think about good and evil. And I also thought about the fact that growing up, I was a huge Nancy Drew reader. And for a lot of the women writers in my generation, we became sort of the women who wrote Nancy Drew Comes of Age. We wanted to write strong female characters who rescued themselves instead of the brawny hero leaping out of the closet and saving them. And that sort of was what I thought I was going to be doing. And then things went in a whole bunch of really crazy directions. Uh, at a certain point when I thought, this is my life. I spend 9 months writing a book and 3 months promoting a book and then go back to writing again. At book 6 in my Thea Kozak series, the publisher dropped the series. At that time, I didn't know that that happened to everybody, and that was sort of like the way that life was. But while I was sort of sulking around in despair, uh, a friend of mine who I had tossed back and forth for years the idea of, wouldn't it be fun to write, to do a short story anthology that took a snapshot of the New England crime writer's mind. And she called my bluff and said, okay, we're going to put an anthology together. Do you want to be one of the editors? And all of a sudden, I jumped over the desk onto the editorial side, and we put together an anthology. And the anthology was so much fun, and it was so exciting to put people into print and to do book events for people who might never have been published before, and to give them voices and to create, the texture of the long and short of an anthology. That we did it for 7 years. And at the same time, I thought, well, publishers don't get to decide whether or not I'm a writer. So I am a writer, and I've just spent the last 6 years running in and out of my police chief's office and riding around in police cars and asking cops questions. And I'm really interested in them. Maybe I will try to write a book with a cop as my character. And that sort of led me to Joe Burgess. And I started writing the Joe Burgess books. I fell in love with Joe and his trio of, the trio of investigators in that series. And one of the things that was really interesting about that was that going from Thea, which was a first person point of view, it was, she's just saying she was doing it, she was living it, to writing the guys, I suddenly found myself switching to third person. So that's a third person point of view. He did this, he did that. He saw, he noticed. And in the process of working on Joe Burgess, I realized that I needed to know a lot more about the Portland Police Department, because it's a fact of the crime writer's life that our readers are very sophisticated and very demanding, and they have high expectations. And so it's our job to do a lot of research and make sure that we don't have a lot of holes in our plot. So I went to the Portland Police Department and ended up making friends with Joe Laughlin, who was the lieutenant in charge of their criminal investigation division at that point. And Joe and I became very good friends. And that's where, if I hadn't already gone astray, I went astray, because I was already doing something different when I became the editor. So I was doing editing and short story writing. And now I was writing police procedurals. And then Amy St. Laurent went missing, and Joe was the supervisor on the case. And he said, this case is so different from anything else that we've ever done. I want to write about it. I want to write about the police experience of working on this murder case. And he said, and someday I'm going to do it. And he kept going through the someday I'm going to do it for a year. And I got tired of listening to him. And finally I called him up one day and I said, Joe, you're never going to write that book on your own, but what if we wrote it together? And it had taken a great deal for me to work up the courage to make that suggestion, because A, writers are solitary. We don't collaborate. We don't necessarily play very well with others. And B, I had absolutely no idea how to write true crime. I don't read it. So I've got a writing, so we went through no, and then maybe, and then yes, and then several years, during which time I found myself sitting in the breathalyzer room at the Portland Police Department, reading through all the files of that case and going to the hearings and reading the trial transcript, and so forth. And we ended up writing Finding Amy, which was a great adventure and took years and was brutal in terms of writing about somebody who was real, writing about a real person's story and becoming so attached to her that I said, done, never going to write a nonfiction book again. And it turns out that I wasn't telling the truth, because at the launch party for Finding Amy, one of the wardens that had been instrumental in putting together the search that ultimately found Amy said to me, after he'd had a couple of drinks and I'd had a couple of drinks, and he said, "So Kate, when you're ready, I've got another one for you." And that ended up with me driving all the way up to Miramichi, New Brunswick, time after time, and turned out to be a book that took 5 years to write, because no sooner did the case get through its appeal than the judge ordered a whole new trial. And so we had to go through the whole thing again, because you can't write, it turns out, a true crime unless the story has an ending. So that was that, and I was done, and I was never going to touch nonfiction again. And then one of the wardens who was, very instrumental in both of those books was retiring from the warden service and called me up and said, "All my life, people have told me that I'm a great storyteller and I should write a book, but I don't know how to write a book, so could we talk?" And that became A Good Man with a Dog, which was memoir, not fiction or true crime or short story. And then Joe and I ended up writing another book, which was straight nonfiction. And so far, no one, fortunately, has come calling, and I'm back to writing fiction. So you guys should ask me some questions, because I can talk about anything. And I always say when I'm doing an author talk that we're kind of like bipolar about this. We spend most of our time in our rooms, which means that the quarantine isn't really that much different. But if they let us out and they let us talk, we go on and on and on. Do we have questions out there yet, Danny? No?
I have a
You
couple
guys
of
aren't typing?
and it looks like there's some hands
Oh,
raised. So we'll take the hand raised questions first, and then I'll go
okay.
through the ones that got sent to me. So give me 1 second, Robbie, and I will unmute you.
Okay.
Robbie, you are unmuted. Go right ahead.
Hi, everybody. Kate, I'm wondering what made you decide to write romantic suspense, which I think is wonderful.
Well, it's a very good question, Robbie. I don't write romance any more than I write true crime any more than I write memoir anymore, But what happened was, I think one of the questions that we are always asked is at library events, at any kind of book event, by any time, anywhere you go, they will say, "Where do you get your ideas?" And I find that lots of my ideas come from newspapers, and they come from things people say, and they come from things that I've read or observed. But in this particular case, this character came into my head. She was driving. She was running away from something. And she was driving and driving and driving, and she was exhausted. And she goes into a coffee shop, and she doesn't have any money. And she gets a cup of coffee, and she goes to the ladies' room to make herself look somewhat presentable after about 12 hours on the road. And when she comes back, there's a man sitting across the table from her cup of coffee. And he says to her, "Smile and pretend you're glad to see me." And I had to know what that was about. I absolutely had to know who she was. I had to know who he was. I had to know what was going to happen between the two of them. And so that just became a book. I just started thinking about his situation, which was that he needed to marry for various reasons, a good old fashioned plot, the will hanging over your head. And she needed to hide out somewhere and escape. And so they, sort of negotiated their way to a romance.
Okay, so there's a couple of questions in the chat now. Our first question is from Jake. And Jake wants to know, now that you've written about real victims, has it changed how you write fictional victims and crimes? And then as a kind of follow-up, one that was sent to me was how you came to write nonfiction and how is it different from fiction? So I can repeat that second one. So Jake wants to know how your writing has changed working with real victims versus fictional?
Well, working with real cops, working with real stories, working with real victims. Um, I mean, I think that one of the things that helped me in writing nonfiction was the fact that I already knew how to tell a story. And I fortunately, in my nonfiction books, got stories that had a sort of a natural story arc so that there was some drama there already. And then the challenge became, how do you organize it? I think that you can't work on stories involving real people, real victims, without a deepening sense of how it is, how the impact of crime is on the people other than the victim themselves. You know, who was the victim is always a question, whether you're writing fiction or nonfiction. But the sort of throwing the pebble into the pond and watching the ripples and seeing how that ripple effect sort of spreads and how it impacts the people who loved the victim or hated the victim, or, you know, who could have been the victim. And there's a huge emotional component to writing nonfiction, especially a story like Finding Amy, where the victim was such a likable woman, such a, you know, a woman who would have brought so much to the world. And so you have that sense of what did the world lose when it lost that victim. So there's that piece. There's the emotional piece, which I think is really important. And then there's the police procedural bit, where, you know, if you spend hours and hours and years talking to cops, reading their reports, reading their transcripts, watching their interviews, asking them and seeing the impact of the cases on them, and also seeing all of the procedure, you know, I have to be so much more careful in writing fiction. And I do, you know, every once in a while, I feel like every book should begin with a caveat which says, if my character in this fictional book uses a gun and shoots somebody, I know that in the real world, he or she is going to be driving a desk for months, if not years, and their career could be completely derailed. But on TV and in written fiction, your character needs to go on, so they can't, you know, sort of be suddenly sidelined in the middle of the plot. And, you know, the book just kind of has to stop there for a year while we go through all of the appeals and all of the investigations that actually happen in a real world police shooting situation. All right, what was the second part of that,
So the
Danny?
second part was, how is the writing process of nonfiction different from the writing process of fiction?
Well, I mean, for one thing, it's real. So you have to be much more careful about, you know, time, place, notes, references, what you say. I mean, when I wrote Finding Amy, there were things that were from the interviews or things that people had said to me that I didn't know what they meant exactly, but I had the amazing privilege, because I'd worked in the Attorney General's office, of having the lawyers in the Attorney General's office who'd actually prosecuted the case sit down and talk to me about how they put the case together and how they chose which witnesses to put on, and where I had gotten the manuscript wrong, and where Dan Lilly, the late Dan Lilly now, was going to sue me if I said what I'd said. So it was, you know, I mean, I keep saying this, and I say this all the time, I am so lucky that people are in the real world are willing to take the time to talk to me and explain things to me and talk me through things so that I can try to get it right in fiction.
Our next question is from Tina, and she would like to know if you have any plans to lay up Joe and have him go through quarantine frustration while trying to use technology to pursue a case. And in parentheses, maybe he broke his leg.
It's a great question. However, the Joe Burgess books in in order to make it even vaguely credible that Joe is actually a Vietnam War veteran, they're about 9 years earlier. So he's not aged out completely. I mean, if you read Harry Bosch, if you read Mike Connolly, in some cases, Bosch has gone from being a Vietnam veteran to being something else because he's still young enough to get around and he's not retired. And don't worry about the cough. A, this is video, so you're safe. And B, it's allergies and asthma. It's not the big C. B, 19. Okay.
So next we have a question from Claire. And Claire, you had a couple of questions. So if you want to unmute yourself and ask, you can, or I can read them. It's up to you. I know you know how to use Zoom. You want me to read them? Okay. So Claire says, one of her rules for writing short stories is to give any character who appears the full stage for that one small appearance. If the character isn't interesting in the moment, it's a cheat. What is your rule for supporting characters in your fiction?
Oh, that's an interesting question that I've never been asked before. Well, I have many rules for supporting characters in fiction. Partly it depends on whether they're like Terry and Stan, who are Joe's colleagues, Chris, who's his girlfriend, and then the house full of kids, and his boss that we all hate. They all get primacy in this story. Sometimes there'll be a witness or a person who they go and talk to, or who plays a role in the book, who absolutely gets the spotlight when they're there. But it's also a rule, I think, particularly for long fiction, excuse me, that if you're not going to use somebody over and over, if they're making a single appearance, you don't want to give them too much stage room, because there's so many, you don't want to over confuse the plot with too many characters.
And Claire's second question was, do you know the ending to a mystery before you begin, or do you figure it out as you go along?
Oh, great question. It really depends on the book. I would say for at least the first 16 or 17 books, I knew how they ended. And then every once in a while, there'd be one where I absolutely know how it ends, like my first Thea Kozak mystery. And when I meet the bad guy, it turns out that I'm wrong, that that person actually didn't do it. And then I have to go back and figure out where I went wrong. And usually it turns out that if there's a switch like that, all the groundwork has actually been laid for the character who actually did it. It's almost as though the subconscious knows what the conscious doesn't. So there's an awful lot. There's so many layers that go on when you're writing a novel. I don't know everything. I usually know before I start who the victim was, why they were killed, how they were killed, where they were killed, what clues I'm going to leave at the scene, who my other suspects are going to be, some of the red herrings that I'm going to drag across the path to confuse the hounds, and then the rest of it just sort of gets played out as I go.
We have a question from Mary Lou. Mary Lou would like to know, speaking of TV, are there any characters that you are really disgusted with or think are good? And they ask Harry Bosch.
And you mean, are there characters on TV that I'm disgusted with? Mary
I'm
Lou?
not 100% sure. Mary Lou, let me find you and I'm going to unmute you so that you can ask.
You can't see her the same way I can, I'm sure. Okay.
All right, Mary Lou, you are unmuted, so go ahead and you can ask your question.
Yeah, like if you're watching any of these series, like Michael Connelly's series, or some of the things that you've seen through Portland, do some of these characters come across as like, oh my God, what is he doing? Or
Oh yeah,
are they believable? Or, you know, do you think it's quite funny the way they act? Or
Bosch, I think Bosch is pretty good. He's not my Bosch. He's not the Bosch that I imagined, but that's okay. Because as Tony Hillerman told me years ago, you write the book that you write, and then when they take it to Hollywood, you just have to let go of it because it becomes someone else's story. There are, I mean, I know things like, I mean, I shouldn't say this in front of my son because of course he's such a wonderful editor, but when I watch The Rookie and when I watch many, many cop shows, I frequently yell at the screen, no, they wouldn't do that. And, you know, that's just, I mean, because for the same reason that Joe Burgess doesn't stand down from the plot when he shoots his gun, things have to happen in a Hollywood way in order to make the story go forward. But I can't stand stupid. You know, I mean, I'm sure many of us have this problem. You're watching a show and you yell, call for backup. Don't go in there by yourself. For God's sakes, call for backup. And my husband says it probably even more than I do. We're yelling at the screen, don't be a stupid cop. You know, you're going to get yourself hurt. You're going to get yourself killed. You're going to get somebody else killed. And that's not okay. But, you know, I'm sure there are plenty of people who are not writers who are yelling at the screen too.
So kind of related, Melanie would like to know if you could tell us about your police ride-along.
Which one? I mean, I actually think the first time, I'll tell you about the first time I did a ride-along. I was in Portland. Joe had set it up. And Joe, I'm sure, had told them, you know, to scare me. So I sort of started my, and I had also been told, they hate you. They don't want you there. You're a huge intrusion. So sit there and be as small and quiet and unobtrusive as you possibly can. So with all of this, you know, I get in the car and we start riding. And I say, what are you seeing? And he starts telling me the street. And he says, you know, you see that guy over there, we're going to be arresting him before the evening is over. And you see that person and blah, blah, blah. And after an hour or two, it's like he's telling me the story of the street. He's saying, this is the house in which we found the kids found the mother's boyfriend who'd hung himself in the basement. And this is the alley that the guy ran down after he killed his girlfriend. And this is and it's fairly amazing to me that, you know, they teach me to see differently. And they teach me, because my job is to see the world through a cop's eyes. They teach me stuff. They teach me all kinds of stuff all the time. And, you know, I will do a traffic stop and he'll tell me what he's looking for and he'll tell me what he saw. And that sort of thing is really amazing. I went on a stakeout once and I spotted the bad guys. You know, and the interesting thing about my first ride along is Joe Burgess is a lapsed Catholic. And the guy I was riding with was a Catholic. Joe, the guy who sent me on the ride along, was Catholic. And so about, you know, 4.5 hours into this ride along, I say, so what do you think your being Catholic had to do with your decision to become a police officer? And he answers the question. I mean, cops, there's an us versus them wall out there. And when you get to the point where you're trusted enough so people will actually tell you things, and they'll tell you real things, and they will let you into their world, that's incredibly exciting. And I feel as though, you know, I've been given a, excuse me, a trust that I have to earn and that I have to keep. That's pretty exciting.
Our next question is from Deborah. Deborah says, you mentioned the Miramachi. Would you ever write a book about Alan, and I'm going to mangle this, Alan Laguerre?
I think Alan Laguerre, there have already been 2 books at least. I certainly had to read them in order to get a sense of, you know, what the police came into Maria Tanassechuk's murder, you know, sort of what the history was. I mean, it was known at that time as Murder Machi. Laguerre was not the only terrifying killer who had been loosed in this small Canadian city. So I read that stuff, and I also read, you know, what you're looking for, among other things, when you're writing real, is the voice, you know, the culture, the sense of place, and all of those things became important. And reading other people's books, including fiction books. The lawyer who was one of the 2 state's attorneys in David Tanassechuk's murder trial, his brother was a famous Canadian writer. And so I read his brother's books as well, which are very, very dark and very sad. And so, you know, you're looking for that feeling. You're looking for what's it like to live in a place where the economy has tanked and you know, there's vast woods in every direction. It's just a really, it's a really interesting thing. So no, I'm not writing about Alan Legere. And while I was there, one of the reporters from the local paper talked to me about a book that she thought she wanted to write. And but I've never gotten back to her to find out if she wrote it. And it sounded like such an important book.
Our next question is from Claire as well. Claire would like to know if you could please talk about the various kinds of research you've had to do to make a book work.
Oh boy, Claire, have you got about 4 days? No, because I mean, one of the things that's really true for crime writers is we do all kinds of research. It's our job. You know, I mean, for example, in the third Joe Burgess book, Redemption, it opens with a body being taken out of the water in Portland Harbor. And of course, I'm not a diver. I've never seen a body taken out of the water, but I wanted to get the details right. And so I asked Joe, because, you know, one of the things that's really important are connections. Particularly if you're a crime writer, you really want to get to experts to ask questions. So in this particular case, I said to Joe, I need to talk to a diver who, you know, works with you to retrieve bodies. And he said, here's the name, tell him I sent you. I called this guy up out of the blue. I said, I'm so-and-so, Joe Laughlin sent me. I need to know about. And he spent 45 minutes on the phone with me, talking me through the procedure. Then I did a lot of online research as well. But basically, you know, you go talk to people, you sit down with people, and you ask them stuff, and they tell you. I ask the medical examiner questions all the time. It's really embarrassing when we're sitting in a restaurant and everybody else is having lunch and I'm asking him about dismemberment. But, you know, it's sort of the work that I do. So, you know, I will send an email. I have a little group of people and they often get emails and the subject line is author needs help. So one day I'm working on a Thea Kozak book and the furnace is out and Thea needs to go to the basement to see what's going on. Well, you know, you can't just send your character into a dark basement because we don't have our characters being stupid. So Thea picks up a flashlight from the top of the refrigerator. So it becomes really important to me, you know, is this flashlight, what's special about this flashlight? Because her husband is a cop and he's a protective cop. And so he is going to have bought this flashlight and it's going to have attributes. So I send out my little email that says author needs help. Joe Burgess needs to buy, I mean, not Joe Burgess, Andre needs to buy Thea a flashlight. I get back paragraphs, including the one, I mean, they told me what kind of a flashlight to buy, which I've probably forgotten by now, what attributes it had, including something which was a silent UI, user interface. And I didn't know, A, why it had to be silent, and B, what a user interface. It's the on-off switch. So, you know, these flashlights can strobe, they can do wide angle, they can do pinpoint, they can do slight, which immediately sends me back to an earlier question about when do you yell at the television about when they're stupid? Almost every single thing on CSI. You know, CSI, you know, they go into a room to search it. They need the evidence, they need the fingerprints, they need the clues, they need the footprints, they need everything. So what do? They go into the room in the dark with a flashlight instead of turning on the light. And so, you know, anyway, but Thea has a very good flashlight, courtesy of a lot of cops, including one who, even though it was a flashlight for Thea, said, well, Joe Burgess came on the force about the same time I did. And these particular flashlights were also good as weapons when the bad guy was being obstreperous. So, you know, it's nice to know that that flashlight has halved its metal. You also know that cops carry more than one flashlight, the department flashlight, but then other flashlights, which also turn out to be really useful. So, you know, the rechargeable one, the tiny one that fits in your pocket, but it can be anything. I mean, in At mystery conferences, we have a wonderful woman known as the Poison Lady who comes and talks to us about all the ways that we can kill people. And, you know, she says, what you really, you know, one thing that would be really good is, and I actually found this when we were cleaning out my mother's house, that there, you know, there's all of these old things that people used to have in the attic or the barn or the shed, which are incredible poisons. They're not making them anymore, but you could get your hands on one. On the other hand, you can kill somebody with lily of the valley. So, you know, it's good to know these things because you never know when you're going to need to poison someone. And I, being, you know, sort of absent-minded and a writer, once gave a dinner party with a book about plant poisons open on the kitchen counter next to the cookbook. This is a true story.
I am greatly amused by that.
My husband closed it before the guests came and said, "Dear, I don't think you mean for this to be out." So I was rescued from a terrible faux pas.
I mean, I'll be honest, I want the glasses that you can find on Etsy where the writing on the bottom is, "You might have been poisoned." So
Yes.
we have, where's this question? So Melanie wants to know if you have the same flashlight.
I have the small one. I have the mini mag light and not the great big honking mag light, but I do have a flashlight like that. It does have a quiet UI or user interface, and it does have the strobe, the broad spectrum, and the narrow pinpoint. And I have worked this flashlight into, you know, into the books because it's so much fun to know stuff. And of course, we all follow the rule that you do your research and you have this much stuff and you use this much stuff because it's the tip of the iceberg that's informed by the iceberg.
I have one more question that was sent to me, so I'm going to open it up to the gallery view again and see if there is somebody who might want to ask a question. So
They're so shy, aren't they?
So does anybody else have any questions before I read the final one that was sent to me? It looks like Claire just sent another question. You could like mail at me or unmute yourself if you know how. All right, I'm going to read Claire's question. Claire says, I'm guessing mostly people enjoy being asked to talk about their expertise. What a great way to develop relationships while working on a project. So more of a comment than a question.
Well, I mean, we could talk about the days when you write gravel and the days when you, the writing is going so badly that you write on your arm with a pen and then you tear the strip of flesh off and you stick it to the page. You talk about writing yourself into corners and getting yourself into these awful situations where you look at what you've written and you think a toddler could do that. A monkey with a keyboard could do better than that. You know, this is not just this magical thing that happens. And I talk a lot about what I call the fluttery muse theory of creativity, in which there are, we go to work every day. We sit there, whether we write good stuff or crummy stuff, that's the job. And you get up, and sometimes you actually have to get dressed to make yourself believe you're going to work. But there are people who, you know, say, I've always wanted to write a book, and sometime when I have a free weekend, I'm going to write one. And I always found that really aggravating. And so the way that Joe Burgess actually came about is that I was angry and I was sad. My sister had just died. And I said, okay, I am going to write a book in which I kill a doctor. And I wrote all day, every day, 12 hours a day for 4.5 months. And I wrote a 500-page book that had to be taken down to a 400-page book. And it didn't happen in a weekend. The other thing that people say to writers all the time is, I always wanted to write, but I tried it once and it was hard. Yep. You know, there's a lot of things that we've always wanted to do that are hard, but they're usually worth doing too. Gee, All these people who are not asking questions. Aha.
We've got some more comments. Matt would like to know if you've ever felt guilty killing someone off.
No. No, I mean, either they were killed because somebody had gone off the rails, or they were killed because they'd gone off the rails. I feel deep sympathy. You know, if you've read The Fifth Burgess, A Child Shall Lead Them, that was just wrenching. That was just horrible. It didn't make me feel guilty so much as it made me feel like, you know, this poor person, and they weren't even real. I mean, people become very real to us. There's no question about that. You know, you spend a lot of time. I spend more time with my characters usually than I do with real humans. And I'm very attached to my characters.
Linda would like to know if you ever find it uncomfortable to get into the mindset of a killer.
I think that probably the answer to that question is that's the reason that I tend to write cops rather than killers. But you do have to understand the killers. And I think that's probably the interesting lesson that I learned when I first started this, is that as a reader, I thought that what writers did was they sat at their desks and made it up. And it became really interesting and really compelling when I realized that one of the things that we have to do is understand everybody's psychology. I wasn't a psychology major. It would have been helpful to be a psych major, but I have an unpublished book that I've been working on for 10 years, and it has a very evil teenage boy in it. And every once in a while, when I was writing it, I found myself at a Christmas party sitting next to a school psychologist. And of course, you know, seize the moment, right? I said to her, here's the character that I'm creating. Here's the scenario that I'm imagining. Let me tell you what I think is his family background, his home and family background, and see if you think, see what what you think of that and whether I'm off the mark. And so I told her about how he'd been raised and what his mother was like, and there was no father in the home. And I was she said, yeah, that's exactly what created that kind of a character. So we do spend a tremendous amount of time interviewing people. Just talking to people about, and I have them, my beta readers include a social worker and often a psychiatrist, and people who don't read mysteries, and people who are picky about grammar, so that you try to get, a bunch of people to get back to you with suggestions that, where you've gone off, where I have gone off the rails. Right, Tina? Oh. Gosh, you guys are not being hard enough. Let's have one of those really, really difficult, Is everyone wearing pants? No? Okay.
So the next question is, how about what's the best mystery you've read in the last year or so?
That's a hard one, because of course all my friends are mystery writers. And so it's sort of like favoring one child over another. And also, of course, when I'm working on a book, I don't read mysteries. I read other things. I've just read a biography of Montaigne, so that's not very helpful. People whose work I like, obviously I love Mike Connolly. And Robert Crace, I like Joe Pike, but I don't like Elvis Cole very much. I think, in our own little Maine circle, we all know that Julia is terrific, and Maureen Milliken does wonderful sense of place, as does Jerry Boyle. I mean, when you read Jerry Boyle, you feel menace. The most ordinary things in the world can be happening and you feel menace. I don't know how he does it. It's almost like he makes the leaves just move very subtly, and you just think there's something out there, there's something wrong, something's gonna happen. So there's just, depends on what you like. Barbara Ross is fabulous. She writes cozies, but they're not. They're traditionals. They're really terrific mysteries. So, email me and I'll give you a long, long list.
I mean, if you want to send us a list of recommendations, we can put it on social media. Kate Flora recommends.
Okay, well, that would be fun.
It would be fun. So our next question is, how is it different writing a female protagonist versus a male protagonist?
Well, I sort of know what it's like to be a strong woman in a world that doesn't always recognize your strengths and is much more likely. I mean, Thea's not blonde, but I get the blonde thing all the time. Somebody once said to me, after talking to you, I realized you're much smarter than you look. Learning to write guys and learning to write cops was an adventure. That's what the ride-alongs were for. That's what, hanging out with them was for, was to try to notice that men speak differently from women. And when I teach writing, I often tell my students that one of their things that they need to do is to spy on the world. I say to them, your mother told you to mind your own business, but if you mind your own business, you can't be a writer because you have to be able to create characters who are not you. And so I used to say, the dressing, none of this works right now. The dressing room at a place like Marshall's, where you just hang out in the dressing room and you hear 1,000 conversations. But for guys, Dunkin' Donuts at 10 o'clock in the morning when guys are taking their breaks and getting their coffee, you just kind of sit there and listen, and you hear all kinds of stuff. And you start to think, guys they're much less likely to qualify what they say. They just say it. And so, but there's a lot to it. I mean, it's when I was working on the book up in Miramichi, one of the things that was really interesting was we would go out to lunch, the cops and me, and I would watch as we went into the room. Brian had to sit with his back to the wall so he could watch the room. Paul often sat with his back to the wall, but he didn't have to. But he was, the deputy chief. So he had a certain decorum that he had to maintain. Dewey knew every single person in the room. And so as he walked into the room, he had to stop and talk to someone here and talk to someone there and shake hands and say hello. And it took him 10 minutes to get to the table. And then he would sit down and tell you every single person's biography. So, they're individuals, but they are guys. And I used to try and ask questions at dinner parties. I would ask about, what's the man's narrative in his head as opposed to the narrative in my head. But they get very uncomfortable. And so I just feed them and let it go and, try to be an observer in other ways. People don't like to be asked directly. What do you see when you see that woman walking down the street? On the other hand, I did a ride along once, and I'm riding along with this guy I've never met in my life in Waltham, Massachusetts. And he says, now that I'm in my 50s, I've started noticing women. Women are everywhere. And that was the narrative for the night. So, people will give you characters. They will, whether they mean to or not.
Okay, I'm back to the gallery view to see if anybody else has any questions. Melanie has a question.
I'm going to ask, so what are you working on now? Can you tell us what you're working on?
I'm working on Joe Burgess 6, which is called The Deceits of the World. And it's an interesting challenge, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to pull it off because I decided to do a fish out of water. So Joe's always in charge. Joe's always the tough guy. And right now, coming off the awfulness that happened in the last book, Joe's on vacation. And he's trying to vacate. He's trying to relax. He's trying to rest. He's completely burned out. And so he's in a place where he's not the cop. He's not the local police. And the mystery keeps sort of coming at him. And he's trying to sit on his hands, and he can't. So it's a very interesting struggle that I'm creating for him and for his family. And I have no idea what's going to happen. We're only 54,000 words in, and I just don't know if he or I are going to be able to pull it off. But that's always the way. I mean, you think you know, you do your best, and sometimes, I mean, this could be the first book that I ever say I give up, right?
No, don't do that. Does anyone have any more questions?
I have to show you this great poster behind me. Can you see it? This is I made myself this poster to take to book events, and I was so excited, and I designed it myself, and then I discovered that it falls over. So you've got book covers, and you've got my logo, and you've got, my book, and a Burgess and a Thea, and I don't know, it's great, but it just sits in the corner of my office.
Well, thank you for joining us this evening. We really enjoyed it, and I think we're looking forward to seeing the next 3 books this year, and screenplay in the works, right? Maybe.
That's right. and with that guy there, yeah, we're going to have a lot of fun with that. And Melanie, you need to read Be My Little Sugar.
Yes.
Follow on to Girls' Night Out. And I also I have a short story in a really, really interesting anthology, which is called The Faking of the President. And it's stories where people have taken, situations that might have flipped things so that in history that might have gone differently. And that's been a real adventure. And I wrote about Huey Long.
Oh, neat.
Was really fun. I got very into Huey Long. So, there's always something new and different to try.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you so much for joining us this evening, being patient with our virtual technology and all the, getting through all the little bits that we have to before we actually meet. So thank you all for coming. We will be sending out the recording. So if anybody wants to rewatch this or follow up with us, send us questions, suggestions for other authors that we might have visit us during this pandemic. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you for having me. This was really an adventure, and it was so much fun. Bye.
Thanks, Kate.
Thank you.
And there are all these people who are hidden. I love the hidden people.
Thanks, Kate, for doing this. That was so much fun.
Thank you for inviting me. Tell the other libraries we can continue to do events, and this is really fun.
Yeah, well, that's what we figured. We figured, why not? Let's just give it a shot. So thanks for doing this. And I kept saying, when Danny and I were talking